across state agencies, and it was great to hear Katie's remarks about the Governor's Council on Climate Change. So we're going to transition a little bit to the specifics of Resilient Connecticut. So Resilient Connecticut is it's a specific project from a grant, and it's got deliverables, it's got a timeline, and so while this broader conversation is going to be, I think, a big part of what we do over the next couple of years, we just wanted to give you some of the details of the Resilient Connecticut project and talk about some of the progress we've been making on that and getting that project off the ground. So I'm up here representing CIRCA and the Resilient Connecticut project, but this has been really a team effort through a number of folks at CIRCA. It's been really great to work with all the CIRCA folks, and if we could have all the CIRCA folks stand up and just, take a bow, Jim. It's a lot of work to put this together today, so thanks everyone for contributing to that. So again, reiterating some of the remarks this morning. So Resilient Connecticut is one piece of the larger grant to the state of Connecticut through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And that was a $54 million grant to the state, $46 million of which went to a series of pilot projects in the south end of Bridgeport. About $8 million of the grant went to create Resilient Connecticut, which is a regional planning project in Fairfield and New Haven counties, and includes a number of activities, planning, technical support, building capacity by partnering with faculty research teams, as well as providing recommendations to the state at the end of the project for creating this type of approach across the state. So in developing that program, Resilient Bridgeport and Resilient Connecticut, one of the first things that was done through an extensive stakeholder process was to create a long-term vision for establishing resilient communities in Connecticut. And really, these are kind of the founding principles that both the pilot projects in Bridgeport and the Resilient Connecticut project are using. So the first is focusing community development around transit. So in connecting to the state's efforts to reduce emissions and make transportation more energy efficient, and sort of connecting with development opportunities along the rail corridor, particularly in Fairfield and New Haven counties. This was meant to be a guiding principle for that long-term vision. Also, creating corridors resilient to climate change. So one of the concepts that we like to talk about is this idea of a resilient corridor, which was meant to be sort of building on the evacuation routes and connecting low-lying coastal areas with upland areas, and how this idea of creating this resilient corridor could be a way to create an investment strategy for communities and the state that can adapt and evolve over time. So creating opportunities for affordable housing and preserving and enhancing the quality of life for existing affordable communities was a primary goal of the grant. Developing energy, economic, and social resilience. Increasing transit connectivity, and in the near term, adapting structures and critical infrastructure in the flood zone to withstand occasional flooding. And then in the long term, protect communities through healthy buffering ecosystems where critical services, infrastructure, and transport hubs are located on safer, higher ground. So what role do our natural habitats, our coastal habitats, riverine, riparian buffers play in the long-term vision of resilience for Connecticut? So, and as was touched on this morning, the Resilient Bridgeport project, building on the grant to Bridgeport through the Rebuild by Design program, was really meant to develop a series of pilot projects that would embody different aspects of that long-term vision for resilience in the south end of Connecticut's largest city. And that included a flood protection system, a raised road strategy to develop a resilient corridor, green infrastructure for stormwater management and protection of existing affordable housing. So in terms of what the Resilient Connecticut project is focused on, is really taking a step back and looking at this issue from a regional perspective, and really identifying the projects and issues that towns can't address by themselves. Looking across regional infrastructure and looking for interdependencies between vulnerabilities and risks, as well as opportunities, identifying resilience corridors and resilient transit-oriented development opportunities, and using all of that to develop additional pilot projects that embody that long-term resilience vision in additional communities along the coast as well as inland in Fairfield and New Haven counties. So in terms of where we're working, during the process of putting together that proposal, there was an assessment of where Sandy was the qualifying disaster for the grant, and so as such, HUD determined that the most additional unmet need in terms of damage to infrastructure and damage to housing was in Fairfield and New Haven counties. So that's why our focus will be in those two counties. But we hope that this approach will be the first step in a larger approach to additional areas of the state. And this map just shows you sort of the overlapping jurisdictions within the county and sort of how complex it is to identify all the different planning processes and ways that projects are getting identified across the area. So in terms of our planning approach, we like to talk about this idea of zones of shared risk. And the zones of shared risk idea is really trying to think about how do we identify risks, identify overlapping risks in flood zone areas or areas where there are climate risks, and sort of create a more coordinated approach. Rather than trying to address and mitigate flooding issues one by one, how does addressing those issues fit into a larger strategic vision? And how does that fit into the larger strategic vision of the region and the state? So rather than creating islands of resilience where we're trying to create walls or raise individual houses, everyone is trying to build a wall around their piece of infrastructure. We're trying to propose a more coordinated process and connect to that larger strategic vision. So the zones of shared risk idea is just sort of a framing tool that we use to sort of understand the risks that are shared among communities and use that as a way to create a more coordinated process. And so one of our breakouts this afternoon will have some folks from the Landscape Architecture School at UConn to do a design charrette where they run through the process of trying to identify zones of shared risk. And so if you're interested in that, you can check out that breakout session this afternoon. So another example that actually was mentioned this morning is Route 146, which is a state road that runs through multiple towns along the coast in Branford and Guilford and Madison. And there's already, anyone who lives down there or has traveled on this road during a nor'easter knows that there are issues with tidal flooding that are in different areas along the corridor. So the idea is to, we could try to address each of these little issues one by one. But in terms of what we're trying to do is to, how does addressing these issues fit into a larger strategic vision for the corridor and a longer term vision? So in terms of how we're proposing to do this work, the Resilient Connecticut project is broken up into, I would say, 4 main buckets of work, how we've divided it up. The first being planning. So this is the effort to develop a Resilient Connecticut planning framework that would guide our process over the next several years. It's developing those regional plans and also the planning and implementation planning for the pilot projects that come out of the program. So in terms of technical support Technical support is the work that UConn and CIRCA will be doing to do flood risk assessment and vulnerability assessment, the modeling and data collection, as well as developing capacity to evaluate our adaptation options and model sort of what the effects would be for different adaptation options. So capacity building is really about partnering with different faculty research teams to address specific questions. So for example, one of the areas that we're doing that, or that we hope to do that, is in the area of public health. So we're working with folks from UConn, Department of Public Health, and Yale, and we have a breakout session this afternoon that will be to talk about, where are we in terms of our assessment of what the public health implications are of climate change in Connecticut, and what do we need to do, what are our next steps to move forward. So if you're interested in being a part of that conversation, please join that session in the afternoon. And then finally, there's engagement. So events like today, the summit today, is a part of that bucket of work, as well as, we started a monthly webinar series back in the spring. So, CIRCA has been involved in a lot of municipal projects, a lot of projects with the regional councils of government over the last several years. So we've really been using our webinar series to kind of bring some of the folks who were involved in those projects to, get lessons learned and going forward. So in addition to that, we hope to start what we're calling the Resilient Connecticut Collaborative. So this would be sort of an advisory group that would meet and be a part of guiding the scope of work over the next several years. And Mariah Kelly is going to do a presentation on sort of our approach to stakeholder engagement after lunch, and so she's going to mention a little bit more about that. So in terms of where we are in the timeline, so we are at the first annual summit of the project. The project is broken up into 3 phases. So the first phase was really to develop that Resilient Connecticut planning framework and kind of learn from all the planning that's been done in recent years, as well as developing the flood risk and vulnerability assessment tools and standing up the engagement program and the webinar series. So going forward, we'll be kicking off phase 2 of the project. This is really the kickoff of phase 2 of the project, where we'll be focusing on the regional planning and the regional engagement, and then phase 3, which will take place primarily over 2021 and up to May 2022. At the end of the project, we'll be developing pilot projects in additional communities. So in terms of giving you a quick progress report of some of the work that CIRCA's been doing. So on the planning side, one of the first things we had to do is to just figure out, asking the question, how is planning happening across these different scales in Connecticut? And not only that, but how is climate change, sea level rise, increases in temperature, how is that being incorporated into existing planning as we were developing our framework? So we really put together a comprehensive inventory of all the plans of conservation and development that are done at the municipal scale, all the hazard mitigation plans, which we've heard from the panel, which have given us a good understanding at the municipal scale, what are the issues and the vulnerabilities that the towns understand at this point. And then in addition to that, after Sandy and Irene, the Connecticut Department of Housing had the Community Development Block Grants Disaster Recovery Program. So many towns, I think most towns at this point, along the coast at least, have a coastal resilience plan with an initial sort of understanding of where the vulnerabilities are and projects that have been identified. In addition, many towns have worked with the Nature Conservancy to do community resilience building workshops, and sort of identify vulnerabilities and strengths and come up with initial projects. And there has been some effort to work those into regional programs as well. There was the Southern Connecticut Regional Framework for Coastal Resilience, which was an effort to identify green infrastructure opportunities and living shorelines and nature-based solutions across 10 towns along the coast in Connecticut. And so, we put all of this into an inventory, and we've been really trying to take the time to sort of understand what the differences and the similarities are between these plans. How successful have they been in implementation of projects? If they have been successful, what worked, and maybe what hasn't worked? What have been some of the barriers and the challenges to actually implementing projects from these initial set of plans? And so, this inventory is available on our website at resilientconnecticut.uconn.edu, and it's something that we'll be continually updating to sort of, keep track of all of the different plans across these different scales. And all of that worked up into a workshop that we held in May down in Stanford. And we invited folks from municipalities and regional councils of government to come together and kind of present some case studies. So we heard from the folks in Stratford about their coastal resilience plan. We heard from folks in New Haven and Guilford, as well as folks from MetroCog and the South Central Regional COG, to kind of talk about, what did they learn, what was the process of developing these resilience plans, and what can we take from it. We also, in the afternoon, we broke up into breakout groups and had a chance to talk through different elements of a draft planning framework. And all of that was put into a workshop summary and a report that's also on the Resilient Connecticut website if you're interested in hearing what the results of those discussions were. So over the summer, we took all of that information from the inventory and the research and the inputs from our workshop and developed a draft Resilient Connecticut planning framework that would guide our process over the next phase 2 and phase 3 of the project. We don't have a lot of time to go through the details of it, but it is attached to the agenda that you got when you came in. So we welcome any feedback if people want to look more closely at it and provide feedback. It's also on our website at resilientconnecticut.uconn.edu, so you can take a look at it there. But just going quickly through sort of the 5 major categories. So the first being set the stage, establish project partnerships, goals, and regional scope. This is really about taking advantage of the existing partnerships and relationships between municipalities in Connecticut and the regional councils of government. And so the COGs are going to be a major part of the process that we use over the next several years. And so we really want to build on all that work that's already been done and not repeat it. And so that first element is really kind of focused on building on the existing partnerships and then identifying places where we might need to forge new partnerships. The second, apply robust science and technical analysis to planning. This is really about bringing the science to the table and getting everybody on the same page in terms of what sort of information and data are we using, what baselines are we using to establish in terms of sea level rise and temperature increases. The third, develop adaptation scenarios through inclusive and participatory engagement. So this is really about making sure that this is a stakeholder-driven process and that it includes the participation of diverse communities. And element number 4, enact equitable and informed prioritization of pilot projects. So again, bringing the equity lens to this and really thinking about socially vulnerable communities and environmental justice communities. We've developed an initial criteria for screening projects called Persists, which you can take a look more closely at in the framework document. And then sort of 5, developing funding policy, implementation, and monitoring strategies for a statewide resilience roadmap. So where do we go from here at the end of the project? So moving from the planning to the technical support. So CIRCA has been working with folks in atmospheric sciences at UConn to develop a Connecticut physical climate science assessment report that was just completed. So we now have downscaled information about what we can expect in terms of temperature increases and changes in precipitation. And that's building on the work that Jim O'Donnell did to establish statewide projections for sea level rise, and what we can expect to see there. So in our top line takeaways from that, we can expect a sea level rise increase of up to 20 inches by 2050. And in terms of the temperature increase, we can expect up to 5 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperatures by 2050. So in pulling that all together and developing a tool to really combine that science with the planning and inform the planning, my colleague Yaprok Ona has been working on a flood risk and vulnerability assessment methodology and tool that can be used, that will be used as part of our planning process, and that will be a resource for the state going forward. So we've started in the coastal towns in Connecticut, but we expect to expand this to additional towns going forward. So we will have a session to talk more about this vulnerability assessment tool this afternoon that Yaprok's going to lead. So if you're interested in finding out more of that, you can check that out. So, and then, it's not enough to just do modeling, but we expect to deploy field instruments and collect actual data to, ground truth what we're learning. And so the technical support team is going to be deploying instruments and trying to combine the effects of riverine and coastal flooding and resolving the effects of different flood control structures and in the course of modeling flooding. And so again, there'll be a session to talk more about this kind of integrated approach to flood risk analysis this afternoon. So if you're interested in that, you can check out that session. And sort of closing with the capacity building, I mentioned earlier about the public health. We are going to be working with folks from UConn and Yale on an economic analysis and cost-benefit analysis that will support the planning process, as well as legal and policy recommendations, working with our colleagues at UConn Law School. So our next steps, just quickly, as I mentioned, in 2020 we'll be focused on regional analysis and regional engagement, and in 2021 through 2022 we'll be moving to the development of pilot projects and implementation planning for those projects. So to wrap up, I just want to close with by making the point that as we've heard, this is going to be a huge challenge that's going to take decades for the state to figure out how to manage. And it's a problem that's bigger than any one project or any one grant or any one organization. And I think I just want to kind of leave with this idea that we really need to work together and try to break down silos where they exist and really leverage the investments that we make to respond to this going forward. And then I also wanted to make the point that it was a challenge to put together a program today that reflected all these different aspects of our project. But the breakout sessions that we have this afternoon is by no means a comprehensive list of all the issues that are relevant to this process. And in the future, we'll have sessions where we focus on additional topics. So with that, I think we're going to close. I don't think we have much time for questions right now. So I'm just going to wrap up there, and we'll go to lunch. But I'm looking forward to hearing from Sean O'Rourke about the Resilient Roadie program and sort of the lessons learned from Rhode Island and setting up their program. So if you have questions, you want to ask me anything, I'll be around today, and my email is up there. Please feel free to reach out. So, okay, thank you.